Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the second round of the Global Chess League, which is being held here in London. Now, my team won our first game, the American Gambits, yesterday, and today in round 2, we're facing off against the Peanut Butter and Giri team, which won their first match. So, I'm on board 1, playing against Anish Giri with the black pieces, and let's jump right into the action. Game starts out with the move knight f3, here I go g6, and now Anish plays move d4. Now, there are many options for white. You could go d4, you could go c4, you could go e4, or the move g3. Now, in recent Title Tuesdays, I played the move d5, g3, and g6 against none other than the 5-time world champion Magnus Carlsen, but today I decided that I want to go for something a little bit different. Also because, keep in mind, that if you win games with a black piece, you get 4 points. Winning a game with a white piece is 3 points. So it makes sense to try and keep some more edge in the game. So I go g6, Anish plays d4, knight f6, we get c4, bishop g7, knight c3, a castle, and we get e4, d6. Now this, of course, is the classic King's Indian defense, which I've used to great success in the past, but it's an opening that I recently have not played very much. We get bishop e2, I go e5, Anish castles, and now I play this move h6. Now, those of you guys who are watching the Speed Chess Championship being held in Paris, France, you probably recall that none other than Alireza Firouzja himself played the system against Magnus Carlsen in the grand finals. So I decided to play h6 like Alireza, we get rook e1, and now I play the move knight to c6, we get d5, knight to e7, and here we have the move b4 being played. Now, this is very similar to the classic bayonet variation of the King's Indian. Usually it occurs in this position after knight 6, d5, knight e7, and b4. But in this game, we've thrown in the moves h6 and rook to e1. So I go a5, Anish takes, I play c5, and now he plays this move a4. Now this game harkens back to my younger years when I was a wee lad between 10 and basically 12 to 13 years old. I played the King's Indian all the time, and this was actually my favorite setup, playing with a5 and c5 here. You clog the toilet in the center of the board, and basically in the long term, you're hoping to attack on the king side. Now, unfortunately, chess has moved forward from those days when I was very young, and modern day theory gives white a very impressive approach, after which white is better. So I take, we get this move rook to a3, and this is a new age computer idea here. White wants to move the knight at some point and swing the rook over to the h or the g file, after which black would have some issues. So I go knight to e8, preparing to play f5, and here Anish plays move bishop d2, and I decide to play this move rook to a6. Now here I could go for f5 immediately, and after takes, if I take with the pawn here, white can go queen to c1, and after king h7, it's going to transpose into a line which could have occurred in the game. So instead here, after bishop d2, I play rook to a6 here, trying to dodge any threats on this diagonal. Anish plays queen c1, and now I go for the move king h7. Here Anish plays move bishop d1, and this is one of these setups for white that's actually very strong here, because I spent a lot of time here considering the move f5, but after e takes f5, g takes f5 here, white can go knight to h4, and the idea is quite simple. If black ever pushes f4, you suddenly open up this long diagonal. The light square B is very active. If you ever push e4 here, for example, in this position, white can still go bishop c2, and after knight to f6, white can play a move like knight b5, and down the road, you're going to move the rook either to h3 or g3. All kinds of issues here. There's even f3 to try and attack on the diagonals, and black's pieces are simply very passive, and white is technically winning. So it's already a very dangerous spot, and it's really sad to me that openings like the King's Indian or this specific variation are simply no longer playable, whereas when I was a kid and growing up, it was completely fine and you just played chess. But now the theory is so deep that even some of these lines in the King's Indian can just be losing by force. Now, would we have ever found this rook a3 idea without computers? Very, very unlikely. But that being said, we live in a world where computers and technology dominate our lives, and nowadays this setup with rook a3 is just very effective. So I spent a lot of time here before playing the move bishop to d7. One of the big issues here is that I did want to play f5, but after takes, let's say I go knight takes f5, knight to e4, knight to f6. Now white can play a move like knight to g3, followed by bishop c2, and there's a lot of pressure on this diagonal here towards the black king, and more importantly, there's no attack on the king side. The pawns are not rolling up the board, so white is simply better. So I spent a lot of time, and then I play bishop d7. We get bishop c2 here. Anish has b's on both the diagonals here, spying towards my king on h7. So I play b6. Anish goes knight b5. I play knight c8, and now we get this move g3. Here I play bishop to h3, and the reasoning behind going bishop h3 here is that I don't want to let white play a move like h4 and h5, so I'm hoping I can still go f5. Unfortunately, after knight to h4, white is really preparing for this f5 pawn thrust. If I try to go f5 here after takes, I believe white can actually sack the horse here. If I play rook takes f5, I believe there's a rook e4, rook h4 line, and white is just completely winning. Say king g8, rook h4, bishop's under attack, rook's under attack, white's crashing through on the king side too. All of white's pieces are very harmoniously placed, and most importantly, I have a rook that is simply on the wrong side of the board and out of play on a6. So, after knight h4, I play the move knight to a7, and here Anish makes a conscious decision, choosing to repeat in this position. Now, should Anish have repeated here? Objectively, I don't think he would have repeated if this were not a team event. If we were playing an individual event where it's me versus Anish heads up, I think the game would have gone on. But in a team format, when you look at the other boards and you try to strategize on what the matchups are, this actually makes a lot of sense because it is the only board where the peanut butter and jelly Alaskan Knights are or the peanut butter and Giri Alaskan Knights, I should say, are slight underdogs, whereas on most of the other boards, they have a slight advantage. So, Anish chooses to make the draw here, and you're probably, well, now it comes down to all the other boards. Unfortunately for my team, Anish made the correct decision by taking the draw because we would go on to lose on 4 of the other 5 boards. Duda on board 2 is able to draw, but we lose the other 4 boards. We get crushed by a score of 14-2, and we suffer a huge loss in the second round. So what does this mean? The tournament is very long. There are 10 more rounds, but it's definitely a difficult start to lose like this in the second round. But with 8 more games to go, there's still a lot of chance. And I also would say for myself, as the tournament starts to sort of become a little bit more clear in terms of who's really on form, who's not on form, I probably will start to take more chances and try harder to win games with both colors. So, game ends in a draw. We get crushed by a score of 14-2. We're now on a score out of 1 out of 2. And we're going to move on to the next game that we are going to recap. So, in this game, we have the big matchup, the rematch from the Speed Chess Championship, which was recently held in Paris, France, between Magnus Carlsen, the 5-time world champion from Norway, and Alireza Firouzja from Iran, who currently is representing France. So, Magnus with the white pieces, and he opens with the move d4. Alireza goes d5, gets c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, knight c3, and now we have the move c6. Now, this is what is known as the semi-Slav Moran variation. Basically, black puts these pawns on f7, e6, d5, b7, c6, d5 to create the mini pyramid of Giza, and you're hoping to create some chaos in the center of the board. Magnus plays move g3, and this is a very aggressive approach. White can play bishop g5 going into the Moscow variation, or e3, which is the Moran. At any rate, Magnus plays g3 instead. And the reason this is so sharp is that white is gambiting a pawn here on c4 and playing for a lot of play in the center with the big white pawns, or the big white center, as we'd like to call it colloquially. So we get bishop g2. Alireza goes knight d7. We get a4 played here to stop black from going b5. And now Alireza plays bishop e7. We get castles, and Magnus plays the move a5. Now what Magnus is hoping to do here is he wants to play something like a6 here to chop away at the structure on the queen side. Now the scope is open, and both of these pawns on c4 and c6 are weak. Whereas back here, you'll notice that the pawn is currently guarded on c6 by the pawn on b7. So Alireza goes knight d5 here, trying to clog this diagonal so the bishop doesn't have the same threats anymore. Magnus plays h4 here, and this is a move that is, again, very much in the spirit of modern day computer chess. Harry to h4, pushing p on the wing is a stockfish / AlphaZero / Leela concept where you try to take a bunch of space. Now, when Magnus plays h4, his idea here is to play for knight to g5, maybe e4, maybe something like, let's just set something up, something like this, and then a queen c2 to hit the pawn. There's always e4 to expand in the center of the board. You can even maybe consider at some point playing something like h5 followed by h6, trying to create weaknesses on the dark squares. So it's a very flexible move, and it basically asks black the question of what are you going to do? So Alireza goes bishop b4. Magnus plays bishop g5. We get knight 7 f6, and Magnus goes queen c2. Now, currently, Magnus is down 1 pawn, but due to this pin here towards knight, the pawn pushing in the center, as well as the ideas of pushing the pawn on the wing, the computer actually gives white an advantage, even though white is down in material. So Alireza decides to get greedy here. He plays move bishop takes a5, and this reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from a movie some years back by Michael Douglas, who played the character of Gordon Gekko, where we get the phrase, greed, for lack of a better word, greed is good. So Alireza trying to be very greedy here. He's grabbed 2 pawns on the queen side, and he's basically telling Magnus that the king side attack is complete Bologna. So Magnus goes e4, building the big white center. We got bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and Alireza plays move knight e7. Now black, as I said, has 2 extra pawns. You'll notice these extra B and A pawns here, but white has the 2 Bs as well as a big white center here, and ideas to try and attack on the king side. Magnus goes knight to e5 here, attacking the pawn on c4, but also potentially planning to play f4 and f5 to rip open the f file as well. Alireza goes b5, guarding the pawn on c4, and now we get the move queen c1. Here, Alireza plays king h8. Worth pointing out that Magnus's idea behind queen c1 is that if black tries to break the pin with h6, white will probably take the knight and then go knight g4 here, and suddenly these pawns on f6 and h6 are super weak, and black is in all kinds of trouble. So Alireza goes king to h8, Magnus plays move queen f4, we get knight eg8, and now Magnus is able to take this pawn on c6, and it's looking very much like this is going to be a classic Magnus Supreme. He is only down 1 pawn on the queen side now. Additionally, the fianchettoed bishop on g2, the scope is likely going to be opening in the next couple of moves, and it's looking really, really horrible for Alireza. So he goes queen b6. Magnus plays move queen to d6, attacking the rook on f8, and now we get the move bishop b7. Magnus plays move e5 here, opening up the scope for the fianchettoed bishop and attacking the knight on f6 at the same time. Alireza goes bishop takes knight, I should say. We got bishop takes bishop, rook to d8, and now Magnus plays move queen c5. Now you're probably noticing the eval bar has gone down a little bit. I believe that after bishop takes c6, queen c6 was a little bit better, and after knight d5, if white gives up the fianchettoed bishop and evens the material here, due to these 2 pawn chains, the pawns in the center of the board, as well as the wing pawns, combined with a very passive knight on g8 that simply can't jump into the action, white should be much better. But Magnus is happy to go into an endgame here. Obviously, Magnus is supreme wizard. He wins so many of these queenless endgames, and we reach this position after h6. Magnus plays bishop c1. We get knight d5. We have bishop takes pawn, knight takes, and bishop c4. Now, as we look at this position and take stock of the resulting endgame, the material is even here, but white has the 2 Bs versus D's knights, and if you can activate the Bs on some diagonals, white should be better. We get rook d4. Bishop a6 is played here. Rook d4 is a mistake, by the way. Knight e7, trying to stop the pawn would have been better. But after rook d4 and bishop a6, now black has serious issues. There's bishop b2 to pin the knight and the rook. White is also pushing p with c6, c7, c8, and suddenly Alireza is losing. So he goes knight to d5 here. If he were to play knight e7, stopping c6, there's bishop b2, attacking the knight. After knight to d5 is played here, now you can go c6 and c7 with bishop c3, and black will be losing some material. So we get knight d5. Magnus pushes his p with c6. We get knight e7, bishop a3, and Alireza plays rook e8. Here Magnus plays move rook fc1, and what you're seeing here is the power of these 2 Bs combined with this passed c pawn going up the board. And at this point, it's really a question of can Alireza survive until they get low on time. We have knight c7, Magnus plays bishop f1, we get knight d5, and now we have the move bishop c5, rook to d2, and after rook takes a7, the smoke has completely cleared here. White is simply up a pass pawn on c6 with the 2 Bs versus D's knights. Magnus should win the game. Keep in mind, he's also up 2 minutes on the clock here. So Alireza goes rook c8. We get to move bishop d6, and now we have f5 being played, a desperado move, trying to push p on the king side, trying to create some weaknesses, but mostly I think trying to get Magnus to think. Magnus decides to take the pawn here, which is a bit of a committal decision here, because you will notice that white has a bastion as well as a wooden shield. You have the bishop on the outpost on d6. It's also covering all the diagonals and targeting the knight on c7. So Magnus goes for end peasant. We get pawn takes pawn, and now we have the move bishop to h3. Magnus showcasing the power of the Bs with all these diagonals that the bishops can move on. However, the computer here does not like this move. It actually wants rook b7, I think followed by rook to a1 and rook a7, creating a double stack on the 7th rank and winning the game. Instead, we get bishop h3. Alireza goes knight to b5 here, and now we get to move rook d7. And Alireza is able to use D's knights to start forking everything. The bishop and the rook are under attack here, and suddenly it's getting very, very tricky to try and play perfect chess and win the game. So Magnus plays the move bishop f4 here, and this is a mistake. Understandable to play this move. If Magnus had found the best move, which was rook to b1, attacking the knight, you could sack the rook, and if black were to take, after takes, rook d8, there's now the move bishop to e7, attacking the rook, you're attacking the knight, you're attacking the pawn, and white will win the game with these bishops. Instead, Magnus plays bishop to f4 here, and now Alireza is able to trade everything down. And at this point, Magnus is up 1 pawn in the endgame. He's got the 3 versus 2, but Alireza has these knights, and really here, it's a question of whether Magnus's technique will be good enough to win before we get a mad scramble to finish. As I mentioned in yesterday's video, the time control is 20 minutes with 0-second increment. 0-second increment, so if you get low on time, you can flag. So Alireza goes knight c5. We get bishop c4. Knight d6, bishop f1, king g7, and here Magnus plays bishop a3. Now we get knight cb7, and Magnus goes bishop g2. And this move is a slight mistake here. What Magnus should have played was bishop to a6, because now both of these bishops are attacking the knights. The knights are really glued here. If you move a knight, you lose this one. If you move the other one, you lose this one. And so because the 2 knights are stuck here after, say, king f7, let's just say king g2, king g7, and g4 here, I think in the long term, white probably should be winning in this position because your knights are just stuck completely. At any rate, Magnus plays bishop g2, and this is the start of going wrong, because now he lets Alireza off the hook, as you can move the knight to attack the bishop, and suddenly these knights are not coupled anymore. They're loose, they're free, they're roaming all over the board, and Alireza has some chances to save the game. So we get bishop c1, knight c5 is played, bishop f1, knight e5, king g2, and now after knight e4, Alireza's knights are free, and it's a question of can Magnus start to push the pawns and maybe win the game. Keep in mind, time will play a role at this point. So we get bishop b2. Alireza goes knight d6, bishop e2, we get knight b7, f4, knight f7, and Magnus plays king f3. Now what Magnus is trying to do is slowly but surely push these pawns up the board and use the pin on the diagonal to win the game. We get knight c5, king e3, knight d6, and now Magnus plays g4, intending to go for g5. Now, I think at this point, probably some slight errors here from Magnus. g4 right away might have been a little bit better. I guess at knight d7, it feels like there's maybe even bishop b5 followed by g5, and it's hard to believe that Alireza could survive this. So we get this move king e3, knight d6, g4, Alireza goes back, and now we get to move bishop a3. Now, one thing I want to point about this endgame, by the way, a very important factor, is that if somehow we were able to get something like this, and I'm just going to set it up, an endgame like this, for example, this endgame is theoretically drawn with perfect play, but with 2 bishops versus the knight, it is possible to actually lose this endgame if it were to occur. So we get king to e4. Alireza goes ah5. We get bishop c4. And now these knights are getting pushed back, and Magnus is simply taking the pawn on h5. Here we get knight to h6. King d5 is played, which is a mistake, by the way, and knight f5 occurs on the board. Now, keep in mind, at this point, players are down below 1 minute on the clock. Alireza down to 24 seconds. Magnus with 1 minute. Anything goes here. You just got to move quickly, so we're not going to be critical if there are errors. That being said, if Magnus kept the king on e4 and simply played bishop c5 here, avoiding this knight f5 move, his chance of winning would be much higher. So we get king d5. Now we have knight to f5, bishop d3, knight takes h4, and Magnus goes bishop e7. We get knight f7, king e6, and now we have this very tricky move, knight to g2, because after takes and king h6, we have the chance to reach this endgame. After takes, say bishop c2, and knight takes h5, where we have the 2 bishops versus the knight. Now, white is actually, I believe, winning in this specific endgame due to the very bad placement of the king, but with seconds on the clock, you don't know, and Magnus probably thinks he can avoid going into this. So we get f5. Alireza checks, we get takes, and now after bishop d4 and king h5, Alireza has survived the worst. He's reached the endgame with the bishop and pawn versus the knight. It should be a draw, but the players are down below 20 seconds. Magnus is 19, Alireza is 14. What is going to happen? So we get f6, knight f4, Magnus goes king e8, knight g6, f7, and now after king g5, the knight will always stop the pawn from queening, and so long as you keep the king close to this pawn, white has no chances to win. So we get king d7, king f5, bishop g7, king g5, king e6, Alireza checks, he goes back to g6, we get this, and now we get the move king h5. Now Alireza here should have played the move knight to f4 check to keep the draw in his pocket, but instead he plays king h5, and this is a huge mistake, generally speaking, because it now allows white to go king f6, and Magnus is actually winning the game. If you move the king, you lose the horse and white gets a queen, and if you move the knight anywhere, white gets a queen anyway and wins the game. So it's a very tricky situation here, because if Alireza goes knight f4, the game probably ends in a draw. But what you also will have noticed is Magnus is now down to 4 seconds. So Alireza might be trying to keep the material on the board to win the game. So we get king h5, king f6, Alireza goes knight f4, we got queen, king g4, king e5, huge blunder by the way. Magnus needs to learn how these knights move because he blunders back into knight g6, forking the king and the queen. We get king e4, and here Alireza plays the move knight h4, and Magnus Carlsen flags on the clock. Now, this is a very dirty flag from Alireza because knight takes f8 obviously would lead to a draw. If they were playing with increment, Alireza would take, but instead he goes for the move knight h4. And being as this is a team event specifically, I don't really have an issue with Alireza going for this dirty flag instead of taking the queen and making the proper draw, because in a team event, you never know when the points are really going to matter. Now, on the other hand, this is a very weird time control because within FIDE tournaments, we have not had many tournaments without increment for, I would say, at least like 20 years. So the players, I think, are a little bit unfamiliar with the rules. And the reason I bring this up is that in 2018, when I played Magnus Carlsen in the Fischer Random World Championship in Norway, there was a similar situation where he had a rook and knight, and I had a rook, and Magnus actually ran out of time, and I won that game because he flagged. But the important thing is that I actually grew up in the United States where we've played without increment for many, many years. So what happens in a situation like this, if you're playing with the white pieces, is that you can claim that there are no losing chances. And so basically what happens is you claim that you can't lose the game, meaning that your opponent can accept a draw offer, at least in USCF rules. Maybe FIDE rules are different, but you can accept a draw offer, or you can play on with a delay or an increment where the player will accumulate time per move. But Magnus forgets this rule, and he gets basically dirty flagged in this game, and Alireza gets the win. No doubt Magnus is very unhappy about it, but that being said, his team got completely steamrolled in this match. Pragnananta also got flagged, and I believe they lost something like 4 games out of the 6 with a black piece, and they lose the match by a score of 17-3, which is very, very rough. So, unfortunately for Magnus, he ends up losing this game. He played a great game pretty much, but at the end of the day, the time control matters, and they're playing without increment, and Alireza, who is a younger player, simply is a little bit faster at the end of the game, and he proves why he is one of the kings of bullet chess. So, big win for Alireza, big win for his team. For Magnus, a very tough loss. His team did get a drubbing anyway, much like my team, so I doubt that he's too unhappy with the result, but it is what it is. So, on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the second round of the Global Chess League being held here in London. If you are not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with more recaps after Games 3, Games 4, as the tournament continues in the coming days. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your day. I'll see you very soon. Bye!